Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Someday good news, but not today. Deadline, same as been all along, for quizzes for part 1. Deadline file on September 18th, and end of day, 11:59 to 9 p.m. Exam 1 covering part 1, and quizzes part 2. Deadline file October 16th, also end of day. Exam 2, quizzes part 3. Deadline file November 13th, also end of day. And exam 3, exam 4, and quizzes part 4. Deadline to file December 4th, also end of day. And then exam 5, the final deadline to file is on Friday, December 11th at noon. And then for the paper, if you wish to do a draft, deadline for that is November 16th. If you want to get the exciting +5 bonus, that is November 18th. If you just want to get the full credit, that's November 25th. And if you want to get half, that is December 4th. And for turning the final version of the paper in, that's end of day. For the draft, that would be end of office hours. Before pressing on to the new stuff, any stuff about any previous stuff or stuff to be that needs more stuff?
What's going to be on it? Like, what can we expect to be put on?
For the quizzes for part 1, it'll cover the stuff we started talking about on day 1 through up to the end. So it'll include the stuff about like what is ethics. It'll include the argument basics, like what's an argument, inductive arguments, deductive arguments, sound, unsound, valid, invalid. The 3 inductive arguments you looked at: argument by analogy, argument by example, argument from authority, and then these methods. And then in the reading of the notes, I have them broken down by section. So when you get through, you see where it says, part 2. That's the end of the stuff for part 1. You're welcome.
So we only so quiz 1 will be only about part 1.
Oh well, there's the quizzes for part 1, and there's actually in the folder there's actually several quizzes because they're essentially broken down. Each quiz corresponds to about a week or less, because there's 4, well, including the syllabus quiz, there's 4 quizzes for part 1, basically one for each week. And it'll say like what the quiz is, what particular things that it covers.
And the sample, so the sample quizzes are not, it doesn't correlate with the quizzes for quiz 1. No?
Oh, well, there's the quizzes, and there's several for each section. And each quiz corresponds to about a week of material, but some of them I put in like lots of extra quizzes, so it may correspond to like a single day. But each quiz will say what it's about in particular. Because there's about, I think I've got about 23 plus quizzes, and so some are broken down more finely than a week. And then there's an exam for each section. So the exam 1 covers just part 1.
Okay.
And exam 2, just part 2. The final covers all 4 parts. And the sample questions, sample exams, they correspond to the parts. So sample questions 1 corresponds to part 1, exam 1. And the sample questions, the practice exams, don't count against you. I mean, it'll give you a score for it, give you the answers, but it doesn't count against you, but it doesn't count for you. So it gives you a chance to take them without risk. Except for emotional risk, of course. Okay, anything else? Okay, so last time we were looking at a method of inconsistency. And now we turn to sort of a close relative and cousin, as it were, of this method called consistent application. And it rests on the following concepts. There's an assumptions. The basic idea is behind the method to introduce you is this. As we saw with inconsistency, if someone makes 2 claims and they both can't be true at the same time, they're inconsistent. So one of the claims, at least one, has to go. So if we know the two claims are inconsistent, at least one of them, perhaps both, are false. We may not know which one is false, but we know at least one of them is not true. Now, consistent application, this is the idea that a moral principle, rule, standard, etc., has got to be applied the same way in similar circumstances. Now, to use a quick illustration of this, think about, I'll take the example of a class. If there's a standard for grading, say, tests or papers or quizzes, for them to be consistent, it means that it's got to be the same standards to apply in each case. Now, this rests on certain assumptions. One is the assumption that morality is supposed to be impartial, that it's not supposed to be, partial. It also rests on the assumption of equality, that at least initially, everyone is morally equal, and that entities that are equal need to be treated, well, equally. And also a key assumption here is what's called relevant difference. The idea is that you can only justify treating things differently if there is actually a difference between them that is relevant, that warrants that. And that's a lot of concepts and stuff to sort of hopefully, clarify it and bring the method together. Here is basically how it works. It's like the method of inconsistency or attacking inconsistency. It's kind of an attack method. The idea is typically you wouldn't use this in your own paper to argue for your position, although potentially you might. The idea is typically to criticize someone else for being inconsistent in their application. And so basically here's how the method works. Step one, what you do is try to show that a person is applying a standard, rule, principle, policy, or procedure one way in one circumstance or set of circumstances and applying it differently in another case or circumstance or set of circumstances in a way that's inconsistent, that they're not applying it the same way in similar cases. And then, of course, the force of this is the charge of inconsistency, that they're not being consistent in this application. Now, to illustrate this, I'll use two concrete illustrations to show how the method would be used as a form of criticism. Now, many, many years ago, I was watching TV with a friend of mine who was a, feminist, very devoted to equal rights, etc. And a show came on the news about a country club that had been male only, excluding women. And the courts had ruled that they couldn't do that. That was, against the law. And of course, she, approved of that, as well she should. And then about, 20 seconds later, an ad came on for a woman's only gym that only allowed women and excluded men. And so naturally, I turned to her and said, well, you approve of, the men's country club being forced to admit women, but how can you justify a woman's only gym? And if the principle, is people should be treated equally regardless of gender, then men's only country clubs would be out, but a person could not defend women's only gyms on the grounds that it'd be inconsistent. If we say that, well, men can't keep women out of their clubs, but women can keep men out of their clubs, that seems to be an inconsistent application of the principle. So to be consistent, either men have to be allowed to exclude women, or women cannot exclude men from, there cannot be women's only gyms.
Can you repeat that again? What is consistent application?
Sure. Let me be clear and make use of badly drawn cartoons, because everything is better with bad cartoons. Now, consistent application would be this. Suppose I have a particular standard. Let's take, let's take a concrete example of, moving aside from ethics, let's take an example from the class. Suppose I require that each paper have those 4 sections. Now, that's my standard. What I have to do to be consistent is I have to apply that to everyone. I have to apply it to each person, each paper. Now, if suppose you leave out section 3, you don't do your objection reply, and you get say a 60 on the paper, and you say, well, why did I get a 60? And I say, well, that part is worth 40 points, so that's why. But then suppose you're talking to someone else, and they didn't do section 3 either, and they get like a 90. Well, in that case, I'd be inconsistent, because if my principle is, section 3 is worth, 40 points, for everybody, and in your case, I take off the 40 points, and someone else gets nothing taken off for it, that would be inconsistent in my application, because I should be applying the same principle in each case. If my principle is section 3 is worth 40 points, anyone who doesn't do section 3 should not get those 40 points. And if you find someone who didn't get those points taken off, it'd be right of you to, complain, to say, look, you're not being consistent. You say your standard is that's worth 40 points, you took 40 points off mine, this other person didn't get 40 points taken off. But I suppose I say, well, that person's got a red hat. And your response would be probably what?
Okay, so that's an example of consistent.
Oh, the example of being inconsistent. Because if I'm consistent, everyone who didn't do section 3 would lose 40 points. If I take 40 points off from you, and someone else does the same thing you didn't do section 3, and I didn't take off any points for that, I'd be grading inconsistently. I wouldn't be applying my standard in a consistent manner. And it'd be reasonable to criticize me on that, because the notions of fairness, equality, impartiality, and relevant difference require that I treat the same thing the same way.
So this consistent application in parentheses says normative. How does this relate to the part 1 of is this in the concept that's introduced separately from the other terms that we've learned about deductive reasoning and?
Oh, in terms of how it fits in? Yeah, this is it's an inductive method, and what it is in terms of where it fits in, it's one of the methods used for moral argumentation. So when people are arguing about the ethics of something, to go back to the example, you could use the example of ethics of grades. If let's suppose, take that case. Suppose you did the paper, and you didn't do section 3, and I took off 40 points, which is a standard. And then you find someone else didn't do section 3, and I didn't take off 40 points. I didn't take off anything. Would that be fair with me? No, because if I'm going to, if I'm going to have a grading standard, fairness requires that I apply that standard to everybody. So if I take off 40 points off your paper for that, I have to do the same to everyone else. Or if I don't take off the 40 points for one person, I have to do the same for everyone else. Because otherwise I'm being inconsistent. Now, getting back to the initial example, imagine the following moral scenario. We have a person who says, in the case of men's only institutions, like a country club, they say it's wrong to exclude women, the basis of gender. But then they say, when it comes to a health club, it's acceptable to exclude men on the basis of gender. Now, what a person might say is a criticism might say, well, that's inconsistent. if the principle is people should be given the same access regardless of gender, then true, the male-only country club would be wrong. But to be consistent, we would have to say that the women's only health club would also be wrong. Because a consistent application of the principle people should be treated equally regardless of gender would not be applied consistently in that case. Inconsistent application would require that we treat people the same way. Another example. If you follow the news, you've probably heard of Kim Davis, the clerk in Kentucky who refused to issue marriage permits to same-sex couples, actually to anybody, on religious grounds. Now, people who have defended her have argued that for the following principle, that if a person's religious belief in something prevents them from following the law, doing their, in this case, doing their job and following the law, then the person should be granted an exemption on the grounds of religious belief. Now, suppose we accept that as the principle. The principle is, if someone's religious belief is such that they cannot do, their job and follow the law, they should be exempted. They shouldn't be fired. They shouldn't be forced to follow the law. They should be allowed to exercise their religious belief. Now, if we accept that principle, we have to be consistent. So in every case where someone says, this is my religious belief, it goes against the law, but I must be granted an exemption. Because our principle is, you grant exemptions to religious belief, you have to do that in all the cases. Otherwise, it's unfair. So for example, if you had a vegetarian who was in charge of issuing hunting permits, and they were in a religion, they were suppose they were a Jainist. Jainism is a religion that forbids the killing of anything. And suppose the person says, well, true, I'm the person who issues hunting licenses and fishing licenses, but again, it's against my religious belief to kill anything. So I cannot issue you a hunting license or a fishing license. And if we accept the principle that religious exemptions apply in all these cases, we have to accept it there. Or if we had someone who they accepted the view religiously that pork is an abomination and shellfish is an abomination. Leviticus says shellfish is an abomination. And if someone wanted to open a seafood restaurant, well, if we allow religious exemptions, if this person was in charge of issuing permits for restaurants, they could refuse and say that Leviticus says shellfish is an abomination, no shellfish restaurant. I cannot issue a permit for those. And so the idea with consistent application is, if the principle is accepted, it's got to be applied in similar cases in the same way. Otherwise, it is unfair. And again, this is pretty much an attack method. Typically, you criticize someone by saying, look, this person's putting forth this principle, they're not applying consistently, so they need to correct that. Going back to the example of the grade, if your paper got graded different than other people, you would have every grounds for complaining, a grade appeal, because you need to be justified because one requirement, a moral requirement for a class is you grade consistently, same standard, and you'd have a perfectly good moral argument, and of course legal argument, as to why that grade would be unfair. And again, this is pretty much like an attack method. Now suppose you're on those.
I have a question. Is this like, how you detailed everything in the notes? Is that in the notes?
Mhm.
Okay.
Should be.
I didn't see it. That's why.
Oh, which part?
But it's on.
Oh, was it the examples?
Yeah,
Or?
about consistent application.
Oh, the examples I was using? Or?
No, just saying like as in detailed like how it is, like how molarity is. Not molarity, but like what is good, what is evil. It's just not detailed. I didn't see that in the notes.
The method?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it should be in there. It should be in the, I mean, it's in the moral, it's after the argument basics and right after consistent application, but it should be in
And
there.
that's still in part one, correct?
Yes, but it's probably several pages in part one. I don't know the exact page number, but it's several pages in.
Okay.
Now, what if you're on the receiving end of this? That someone accuses you of being inconsistent in your principles. And take an example. Suppose, like, my friend who was in favor of, gender removing the gender barriers in the country club, but favored having women's only gyms, how could a person respond to that charge of inconsistency? Well, one option, which is a response but not really defense, is to admit the mistake. So what a person might do is say, well, you're right. If I am for allowing, women into formerly men's only country clubs, I have to do the same thing in formerly women's only organizations. You can't have gender discrimination. Of course, that's not really a defense, but that's could be the right thing to do. A second option is to do what's called dissolving the inconsistency. That is to show that what seems inconsistent really isn't. In other words, basically justifying it. Now, the way to do this in a principled way is to appeal to a very useful principle called relevant difference. And the idea is this. If you can show that the two cases actually involve a difference that is relevant, a difference that makes a difference, as they would say, then you could show there's really no inconsistency, to show that the different application is actually justified, is actually correct. I mean, to use, first I'll use just a great example. Suppose you have two students, one person gets a 70 on the paper, one person gets a 90. And the person says, well, that's unfair, you seem to be grading inconsistently. And then you look at the papers, and one paper is average, and one is really good. Well, quality is clearly a relevant difference. If someone gets a better grade because their paper is better, that's not unfair. Better quality is relevant. Or another example, if you have two people doing a job, one person gets paid more, you might say, well, that's inconsistent. But if the second person does more work and works more hours, that would be a relevant difference. More hours of work would justify more pay. Now getting to back to this particular example, kind of the challenge here would be this: to find a relevant difference between men and women that would justify a different treatment. So could there be a relevant difference between men and women that would forbid, say, men's only organizations, but justify women's only, gyms, fitness clubs, etc.? Could there be a difference between men and women, or the situations that would justify that? I mean, we do have women's only gyms are totally legal, and people occasionally try to bring lawsuits, but they never, win. And so a good question would be, what could justify that? Because if you decide you want to open a country club and say, call it like Men's World, no ladies, you get sued and you totally lose. But if you open a gym called Ladies World and you exclude men, you're totally fine.
So what's the relevant difference for that, for the women's?
That is the question. Well,
I personally think it's just like based off of historical concepts, meaning that male has always been dominant, I think. And so the women had to deal with certain situations which were unfair for so long that if they now have an opportunity to, in this particular case, open up a gym for just ladies, I think that they deserve to.
I don't see a difference of if men can't have their own gym, I don't think women should have their own gym. I think it's fair to be equal.
yeah, I mean, one replied to,
It should be consistent.
yeah, one replied to this is a difference. Another reply is, well, it's not really a justified difference. I mean, you raise a good point. I mean, one way to argue that is the other point you made. You can say women have been, mistreated for a long time, and this is justified on that relevant difference. Men have not been cruelly oppressed by women, and so that could be a difference that is relevant. Another argument people give is, well, do men and women behave differently? For example, if the ladies go to the men's country club, will they be whistling at the guys and, telling them to shake their money makers? and staring at them, and saying, "Ooh, look at that. Look at those buttons." Typically, no, as you point out, typically women don't sexually harass them. It does happen, but typically you're not going to find that sort of, discomfort and harassment. Women going to a men's country club and making men feel uncomfortable, abusing them. But how might men behave around women?
More aggressively.
Yeah, more aggressively. Hitting on them, staring at them, harassing them. And what women can argue is they just want to go someplace and work out without some beefcakes, staring at them and asking for their number and hitting on them. They just want to go and have a workout where they're not going to be harassed. And so you could say that men behave badly relative to women, and so giving women a protected space from the misbehavior of men could be justified. But of course you could raise the point you raise, that even if men do behave not so well, that doesn't, if we have gender equality elsewhere, we've got to be consistent. We can't, say, okay, women get special treatment, men don't. And people can have argued both those positions. Now, a third option is this. Now, when we apply a charge of inconsistency in principle, we're often kind of making assumptions about what principle is being used, because people often don't say, my principle is this, this, this. They just say, I'm for it or against it. Someone, typically wouldn't say, I have a principle of gender equality, blah, blah, blah. They would say something like, oh yeah, I'm for, women being allowed to go to men's country clubs. In fact, they shouldn't be men's country clubs at all. But I think that men can be excluded from women's only jobs. And a person might say, well, you're being inconsistent. And the person say, well, no. My principle is not gender equality. My principle is that women should be able to gain whatever advantage they can, and men should not. Which would not be inconsistent. But you can still raise the question of, is that a fair principle? To use another example, we can go back to the example of the county clerk in same-sex marriage. Suppose people defend the clerk by saying people who have a religious objection against a law should not be required to follow that law, even when that law is part of their job. Now, then a person might point out and say, well, if that's the person's principle, if you have someone who is, a Jainist, they should be allowed to refuse to give out, if they work, say, in the giving out, hunting licenses and fishing licenses, they should be able to refuse to issue hunting and fishing licenses. So no one gets to hunt and fish because it would offend their religious beliefs to issue those. Or if you have someone on religious grounds who regards, shellfish as an abomination, well, I guess there can be no shellfish restaurants, no Red Lobster in the town because it would violate the person's religious freedom. So no lobster for anyone else because of their freedom. Now what a person might say though is, well, no, my principle is not that people should act on religious freedom. It may be something like people who agree with me should be able to do what they want. Or they might say, if someone has a particular religion, they accept, say, a Christian religion, that's okay. Other religions, no. And that would be consistent. If someone says, people who have a particular view that I like, they should be allowed to, be exempt from the law, but if I don't like their views, they should not be exempt. That would be consistent, but it's obviously reasonable to ask, is that a good principle? That people who believe what I like should be allowed to break the law? And the answer is probably, yeah, why not? No. It's probably not a good legal system in which you can just say, oh, I don't like it, so I can just break the law. Now, the final way of responding is kind of a nuclear option, which is to reject the principles this is based on. The idea of, equality, fairness, impartiality. Someone could just say, well, no, you don't have to be consistent at all. The challenge, of course, is arguing why that's justified. So, quick recap. This method is primarily an attack method. What you would do is essentially take someone's principle, like gender equality, and say it's being applied inconsistently, it's being applied unfairly. And then they would be, of course, obligated to respond. One way of responding, again, is to say, yep, you got me. I'm inconsistent. I've got to change my mind. Another way is to say, whoa, I seem inconsistent, but there's a relevant difference. I can show there are grounds for applying the principle differently in a justified way. Third option is say, whoa, that's not my principle. I'm applying it consistently because the principle you're attributing to me is not my actual principle. And lastly, one could go nuclear and just reject the whole notion of consistent application. And someone could just go with, you know, what I like is fine, what I don't like is not fine. You know, screwing consistency. Now again, this is primarily an attack method, so typically you wouldn't use it in your paper unless your paper is to argue that a particular thing is immoral, that because of an inconsistent application. Before pressing on, anything about consistent application that needs more examples, meaningless gestures, or any stuff. Now, reversing the situation is in some ways similar to consistent application. It can be used as a criticism method, essentially to criticize what someone's doing. You can also, of course, use this for arguing. Now, to be a little clearer about it, here's the idea. As the name implies, when one reverses a situation, one is basically doing this. It's I'll use two set of illustrations. One is a sort of a classic parent move, where a parent will say to someone, typically you might have like the one child doing something awful to the other child, like making them cry, or taking their toy and throwing it out the window. And parents will often say, well, how would you like it if someone did that to you? It's also expressed in the golden rule, which of course is, if you got the gold, you make the rules. No, sorry, different golden rule. Do unto others before they do unto you. That's it. What is it?
I think that was it.
Oh, do unto others before they do unto you? No, the classic version is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's sort of an expression of what can be called reversing the situation. That is, you should treat people the way you would like to be treated in their situation. Now, a little more formally, the method works like this. And again, it's typically like a critical method. I mean, you can use this in your paper if you were criticizing the way like a policy or procedure or something's being done. And the idea is basically this. What you've got is typically two parties. You've got one party that is applying, a principle, procedure, standard, or action onto someone else, or you might have like groups, one group acting on another group. And then what you do is you would essentially inquire, would it be fair, suppose you have party A taking action on party B, against party B. And essentially we'd inquire, well, if the situation were reversed, what would A think about being on the receiving end? Would that be just and fair? The method is especially effective when you're actually interacting with the person. If you could ask them, as parents often do, how would you like that if that was done to you? Now, if the person or persons inflicting would not be willing to, have the situation reversed, that suggests there may be something wrong with what they're doing. To give an illustration, if you've been following the news, international news, Syria's collapsing, civil war, Iraq, got ISIS there, also in Syria, and so you've got conflict, in the Middle East, Africa, economic woes, etc. And as people have done since there have been people, people leave areas where people are likely to kill them and where there is not much opportunity. And of course, people are heading from the Middle East and Africa to where? Yeah, Germany is a prime location. You know, heading into Europe, also Australia, the United States, etc. Now, some countries are taking a policy of we're not taking refugees or immigrants. We're just going to either not let them in, going to build a big wall, keep them out, or we're just going to pack them up if they get in, pack them on buses, ship them back, or boats, or send them somewhere else. Germany, for example. Now, one fair way to address the countries that are refusing to accept refugees and immigrants is to reverse the situation, to inquire, imagine if their country was in that situation, or they as individuals in that situation, where their country collapsed into a civil war or terrorist groups, and they were at risk of dying, or their economy had been destroyed, and they had no work. Would they like to be locked up and excluded from from traveling to someplace better? And most people would say, well, they probably say yes, but if they were really in that situation, would they want to be like dying in a raft out in the ocean, or locked up someplace, or refused admission? Probably not. In fact, we could look at World War II. We could look at many of these countries when there was famine in Europe and war and disaster, they emigrated to the United States looking for a better life. And I mean, the United States was sometimes a jerk about it, and people complained about that. Why the U.S. Why are you being such a jerk about immigration? And so we could reverse the situation and say, well, how would we want to be treated? And if our country collapsed and it was full of death and destruction and no opportunity, we would want to be able to go someplace else. And so if we accept that we would want to be treated, better, we need to treat people the way we'd like to be treated ourselves. So that'd be an argument for reversing the situation. So if you're interested in, say, the ethics of, refugees and migration and so forth, that'd be one way to argue. Essentially, the argument, golden rule. How would we want to be treated if we were in that situation? And we would not want to be left to die. We would not want to be left to starve. We would want the people to help us. And so if we would want the people to help us, we're kind of obligated to help them, to treat them as we wish to be treated ourselves. Now, what if you're on the receiving end of reversing the situation? Or, the paper, of course, part 3 is objection and reply. What would be a way to object to reversing the situation? Well, the effective way to have a moment of repetition is this. Is you can prevent the reversal, or to use an analogy, you can jam it, so to speak, if you can show there's a relevant difference that does not allow the rotation. How can that be done? Well, the way to do that is the relevant difference. How does that work? Well, the idea, what you do is you would say that although A would really not like being in B's position, the switch would not be justified because there's a relevant difference between them. In other words, it's okay for A to do something to B, even though A wouldn't like having the same done to them, because there's something that justifies that treatment. For example, let's take, we'll take the illustration with the ant there. Now, most living creatures, even though I grew up hunting, I generally have a policy of I don't kill things unless I absolutely must. And that includes like even things I find in the house like spiders and so forth. I'll make an effort to get them out. And lizards and so on. Now there's one creature that I'll go out of my way to kill. And that is the fire ant. If I see a fire ant nest, if it's anywhere within like the radius of my house where I can get back and get that fire ant killer, and I keep a jug of that stuff, and I'll go and just shake it on them, and then they die, and I feel good about that. Now, a good question would be, of course, this: reverse the situation. I would not want to be killed by fire ants, so therefore I shouldn't be killing them. Now, the way I can prevent the thing from spinning around is relevant difference, that I am justified in doing to them, but I don't have to accept that it's wrong, even though I wouldn't want it done to myself. And the idea would be relevant difference. And one way to argue would be, well, ants are inferior to people. Our needs outweigh theirs, so even though we wouldn't want them to kill us, we can kill them because we're better than them. And we'll see this when we get to part 3, talking about also what justifies eating animals. But in the case of fire ants, the answer is, in my case, not I'm better than them. The answer is they started it. They totally started it. Years and years ago, centuries ago, when I first moved to Florida, I was running and through a park, and there was, the grass hadn't been cut, and I saw ants, on the grass. And I thought, ants, because I'm from Maine, and our ants are just, ants. They just do ant things. And I ran through them, and I found out it was fire ants. And I found out fire ants are, they are demon spawn from hell, full of demon fire. And they stung the hell out of me. And I was like, okay, that's kind of my fault. I ran through them, they're in the grass, okay. But then I found out they'll just go after you. Like, there'll be a fire ant nest, you could not even be doing anything, to bother them, and they'll come after you, they'll go for you, and just attack you. So they are evil creatures. And so whenever I encounter them, I kill the hell out of them, and I feel I'm doing God's work when I'm doing that. So in that case, it's a relevant difference, because they're evil and they totally deserve it. And that prevents the reversal. Now, more seriously, suppose you wanted to argue for the ethics of vegetarianism, not eating animals. One way you could do it is reversing the situation. I gave the example, of, imagine I come in with a, big barbecue sandwich, and people say, oh, that barbecue sandwich smells so good. What is it? I say, well, it's my neighbor's. Got sick of all their noise and crap, so it just killed them. And I didn't want to let all that good, people meat go to waste, so I got that barbecue sauce out, barbecued them up, delicious. And of course I didn't want that skin to go to waste, so I made a belt out of them, some shoes, got to use all the parts. And of course that would be horrifying. Now, none of us would want to be made into barbecue, or made into belts or shoes. And so to reverse the situation, just as I wouldn't want to be barbecued, I shouldn't barbecue animals. Just as I wouldn't want to have my skin made into a belt or shoes, I shouldn't wear the skin of dead animals. Now, that would be, the moral argument reverse the situation. I don't want to be eaten, so I shouldn't eat other animals. Now again, one way to respond would be to say there's a relevant difference. And one of the main arguments people use as to why we can eat animals is we're better than them, so we can do what we want. They're inferior, so they can be eaten. Now, interestingly or horrifyingly enough, people use the same argument about other people. When we want to do bad stuff to other people, they say, those people are inferior to us, we can do what we want. And so interestingly, or horrifyingly enough, the justification for whether it's eating animals or, prostituting, pimping prostitutes, the argument is always, we're better than them, we can do what we want. And the good question is, does that justify being, being awful? And people often think, yes, it does. But good question. So that's a worse situation. Quick recap is, way to remember it is, golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And so the method is basically, in terms of reversing the situation, is morally, would it be fair for people to switch, places? If it would be wrong, to reverse it, then it's probably wrong going the other way. So it's wrong for me to be barbecued and eaten. It's probably wrong for me to barbecue and eat other animals, because I would not want that done to myself. Now, one final point to consider, though, is it's not just you wouldn't like it. For example, a person might cleverly argue, aha, and might ask me, so, you were once a student, did you like getting F's and D's? And my answer is, of course, I did not. I did not like that at all. And so someone might say cleverly, aha, you cannot assign a grade or F or D because you would not like that. Now, to that I would say good effort, but no. And here's why. It's not that the person like wouldn't like it, because I mean I wouldn't want to fail. I wouldn't want to get a D. Likewise, if you said to a judge, would you want to go to prison? And of course the judge would say, well, no, I would never want to go to prison. But the question is not so much would I like it or dislike it, but if I was in that same situation, looking at it objectively, would it be fair? So for example, if I did D work, would it be fair to give me a D? And the answer would be, of course, yes. Would I like it? No, I wouldn't. Would it be fair? Yeah. So if a person is willing to make the change, looked at objectively, if I was in the situation, would it be fair, then they can pass, reversing the situation. If it's just, I wouldn't like that, well, it's more than just I wouldn't like it. It's that it would actually be unfair, to switch that.
So, question, how do you use reverse, like this particular method, reversing the situation in a paper?
Oh, one thing you might do is this. Suppose, to use another example, like the one example I gave was like if you wanted to argue for vegetarianism. You might say, I would not, people who are eating cows and, pigs and stuff would not want to be barbecued and consumed themselves. So to reverse the situation, if it's wrong for people to be eaten as barbecue, it would be wrong for animals to be eaten as well. Put in that circumstance. Like imagine if, pigs became intelligent and they decided that we were delicious. We would think that was, horrifying. They shouldn't eat us. But if we accepted our being cooked and served as barbecue would be morally awful, we have to accept the same would be true of other animals. Or another example, you take the case of same-sex marriage. People may want to not allow that, but imagine the reverse was true, that instead of being, say, heterosexual-dominated culture, we had a homosexual-dominated culture. A little sci-fi here. And suppose that the heterosexuals were a minority, and the homosexuals said, sorry, no, you're abominations, you can't marry. Well, someone who's a heterosexual wouldn't like that, so reverse the situation, they would have to, regard that as morally okay.
Wait, you just said to reverse the situation.
Yeah, I mean, think of like
morally okay with it?
Well, to be a little clearer, think of, so going with the example, suppose someone says, oh, I don't think same-sex couples should be able to be married. And someone replies back, well, imagine, one of those Twilight Zone episodes or Outer Limit episodes where the world is different, where the heterosexuals are the oppressed minority. Would they like to be denied the right to marry their partner just because they were heterosexual? And the answer would be, of course, no. And so since the situation, people would not be willing to reverse the situation, they have to accept that denying same-sex couples the right would be wrong, a morally wrong thing to do. Now, now there's also the ways to respond to it. If you can show there's a relevant difference that doesn't allow the switch, then you could argue against it. For example, someone who's opposed to same-sex marriage might say, well, no, you can't reverse that because there's something inherently wrong with same-sex marriage that makes it different from, different sex marriage that prevents the reversal.
Okay, so basically reversing the situation is one way to prove a point.
Yeah, because the idea what you kind of do is say, yeah, you basically say, if the people aren't willing to give what they receive, to do unto others as they have done to themselves, there's something morally suspect about that. And if they'd be willing to, to be on the receiving end, then the principle is probably okay. To use a final example, the way I design the standards for my class is I do it from the standpoint of when I was a student. I ask myself, thinking back, 1,000 years to when I was a student, would I be okay with, the requirements for the class, the grading scale, the rules for the class? What would I, as a student, what would I think about that? If the answer is, yeah, this is acceptable, then I consider it to be sort of a fair class. But if someone said, well, how would you like it as a student to be kept to these standards, and I said, yeah, I'd hate that a lot, then I should probably change my class, because there's probably something wrong with it. So the basic idea is, if a person would be unwilling to live by their own principles or standards, or live under the same situation, then there are grounds for being suspicious about it. And unless they can show there's a justification for that difference, then they would not be justified in that different treatment. Okay, so that brings us to the end of another exciting adventure in ethics. When next we meet, we shall experience argument by definition. Dun, dun, dun.